I love the kind of stories where an author will mix the literal and the figurative. Writing like that makes me feel like the stories are bleeding into reality, and instead of just being plot point after plot point that's been made up by an author, they are in fact moments from the real lives of their characters. I found a few great examples of that this week in the collection Battleborn by Claire V. Watkins, which I'll link in the description. It's a really great collection of hard-hitting stories that are still really easy to sit and read one after the other. So I want to talk about what this mixing of the figurative and the literal does, how it works, and how it can make our writing better. So let's get started. You might be wondering what exactly I mean by a mixing of the literal and the figurative. As always, I'll give you plenty of examples, but essentially what this technique does is take abstract things like memories, dreams and hopes and turns them into real physical objects within the story. They appear as visible, tangible objects with weight and mass, and that allows the author to write about them and use them in ways that they normally can't. You can present a dream or a thought or a worry as something that your character can just set aside and leave behind. You can lay out a character's entire life in front of them and have them look at it in its entirety. In other words, I think this technique is purpose-built to carry weight and make readers feel moved by things. It can allow you to add context and distance and depth to your stories and to make your stories feel more relatable. Not to mention, it makes hard to write about concepts into simple objects that you can move around at will and use to say whatever you want, however you want. How about an example? This one is from a story from Battleborn called The Last Thing We Need. It was the first use of this technique that I spotted in the collection, and I just really like how the author so easily mixed the figurative and the literal. Like all our memories, we like to take it out once in a while and lay it flat on the kitchen table. We line the shape of our life against that which we thought it would be by now. What I love about those lines is how they make such a difficult concept into such a simple, clear image for the reader to absorb. It's really not easy for writers to add weight and meaning and consequence to the lives of their characters. Those are all abstract things that are inherently difficult to describe. No matter how good a writer you are, some things like how a memory feels or what a person thought their life would be like by now are just almost impossible to communicate with clarity. They're internal processes that people only really experience in their mind. They're emotions and patterns of life that are really abstract and often nameless. But as readers, we know them. And when we read writing like this, we recognise that feeling. We've all taken out old memories and laid them on the table, and we've all lined up the shape of our life and tried to figure out if it was what we thought it would be. But to describe that exactly as we feel it is almost impossible. Especially in a way that makes sense to readers, especially when we're also applying that to a fictional character with a fictional life and fictional feelings. It's not easy for readers to visualise all this conceptual stuff, so by making it an object, by meeting the literal and the figurative, we can get our message across much more clearly. Here's another example of another useful thing that I think this technique can bring to your writing. This one's from the story Wish You Were Here, and what I really like about it is how Claire V. Watkins uses it to create this moment of significance for a character by mixing the figurative and the literal into a really strong image while a character is travelling. Here it is. She inhaled deeply, and when she exhaled, she let her doubts slip out the window with her breath, littered them among I-95. What came to mind to me when I read this was just how simple she's able to make the inner workings of a character's mind. Personally, I think it would have felt really plain if she just said instead that the character pushes those doubts away, or maybe if she'd said that the character pushes those doubts to the back of her mind. Firstly, there's nothing in that we haven't read before. It's not necessarily bad, but I think because it's such familiar wording, my worry is that the reader wouldn't really notice it as much, or wouldn't pay as much attention to it. Secondly, presenting these physical objects of her thoughts creates an image that you can't help but visualise in your mind's eye. It takes what could be a forgettable thought, she's squashed the doubts to the back of her mind, and instead turns it into a demonstrable moment of significance in the story. It creates a turning point, it carves the story into a before and an after, and the reader is left either standing at the side of the road among those cast-off doubts, watching the car disappear along the highway, or we're still remaining in the car and we're seeing all of those thoughts disappear into the backdrop through the rearview mirror. It demonstrates change and advancement and movement in your character, which I think creates a more interesting story. After all, do you want to read a story about a character who's even and steady and predictable, Or do you want to read a story about a character who has the capacity and now the opportunity to change the entire course of their life? When those two things come together, the capacity and the opportunity for change, that's where really interesting stories are born, I think. Having a character stand at a crossroads in their life is interesting to read and it's exciting to write. What's more interesting than the possibility that the story or the character is about to take off in a totally unexpected direction, to break out of the patterns that they've found themselves in and become something else entirely? I've got another example of one of those moments of realization that is emphasised so well by combining the figurative and the literal. This one's from a story called The Archivist. Being with Sam was like standing atop a small hill and seeing my whole fine life unfurled in front of me like prairie. Even though it's figurative, there's such a strong physical image in that for me. Short stories and flash fiction can be read in one sitting, a novel can be read in a couple of days, but that doesn't mean that the characters within them should only live that long. Creating an image of a character's entire life expanding out in front of them before their eyes helps them live in the reader's mind far longer than the length of their story. It helps readers imagine what that character might go on and do after the story's finished, or it makes them wonder how the character came to be there in the first place. It expands their interest beyond the bounds of simply what happens in the story, and as I always say, I think that makes everything feel a bit more real. I said in my imagery video a couple of weeks ago, link up there, that a little bit of magic can make reality feel that much more real. I think when you mix the figurative and the literal like this, that creates really fertile ground for things to feel magical, though they're still grounded very much in reality. There's a really excellent example of that in another story from Battleborn called Virginia City. And I love how by combining the figurative and the literal, it makes something really ordinary into something magical. She laughed so long and hard that her laugh lifted us both above the city and over the mountains, hand in hand, flying. This is perhaps the strongest example of the figurative and the literal mixing together. It creates this impossible event from something as everyday and commonplace as laughter. This reinforces the relationship between those two characters and makes it feel more significant, and again it just gives a wider view of the story and all of the characters within it. Without an image like that, I think it would be difficult to conjure up that level of significance. If it was all internal and one character was just thinking about the laughter of another character, I think you'd really struggle to equal the effect that that image brings. So now that I've thought about what this technique does and how it works, as always, it's time for me to try it out myself. I'm going to try and write a story based around the mixing of the figurative and the literal. As usual, I'll limit it to 100 words for brevity and also because I'm just really enjoying writing microfiction still. Once it's written, I'll read the story out and then I'll give you my 3 top tips for using this technique. So here we go. So I got the story done and I managed to use the technique, and all of these stories that I've been writing are slowly forming a bigger picture in a larger project of mine. So if it feels like there are questions or threads left unanswered through these stories, that'll be why. Anyway, here's the story. I turned something figurative into something literal, and I think it exists. So here's the story. It's called Circling. Julius worried for the boy. He'd stayed awake all night circling his cabin, piling up thoughts about the black car he'd seen in the lot, the lights out in the desert, how quiet the streets felt, how people's curtains twitched. By morning, all those thoughts surrounded him, and he sat bolt upright on his bunk. He looked from one thought to another, and they looked right back at him. Arising in his chest, a breath of something other than stale air, and he rose, pushing past the worries that crowded the door and out into the cloudless desert morning. I picked Julius's thoughts and worries as the figurative thing to turn literal, and then I scattered them all about his cabin and surrounded him with them. The effect I was going for was to make those worries feel more significant and to present them in a way that wasn't just Julius asking himself questions or thinking about how worried he was. I wanted them to feel almost inescapable. Let me know what you thought. Before I give you my final tips, I just want to let you know that a flash fiction story I wrote called The Reach of the Light was published on the 24th of August in 5 South Journal, so I'll leave a link to that in the description down below if you want to go and read the story. Okay, here's my top 3 tips on how to use this technique of mixing the figurative and the literal. Use it to turn abstract, difficult concepts into objects that you can handle easily and move around your story. Bring distance and life to your story by using this technique to expand it beyond the bounds of the pages you write. Use it to mark moments of significance within your story and to make the impossible seem possible. I hope this was useful. If it was, please consider subscribing. Thank you so much for watching, as always, and happy writing.